Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. Today on the show, I'll be speaking with Aysegul Savas. Aysegul is a writer originally from Turkey, now living in Paris, and I think she should be way more famous than she currently is. Good news for me, though, she's been getting a lot of attention lately for her third novel, The Anthropologists. The Anthropologists is a book that I felt spoke directly to me. Now, the characters' lives are very different from mine. They're living in a country that's not their home country, speaking a language that isn't their mother tongue. But their concerns that they have about their choices, their desires, and how they can live a meaningful life could have been pulled from late-night conversations that I have with my friends in my living room, every week. The story in The Anthropologists centers on a young immigrant couple in an unnamed city, navigating friendships, the guilt of being away from family, and the search for an apartment. These are all experiences Aysegul knows well. She's lived in many places throughout her life. She's moved from Turkey to the UK, to Denmark, to Turkey again, to the United States, and now she makes her home in France. Much like in Aysegul's previous fiction, The Anthropologists has the kind of quiet, intimate, character-driven story where not a lot happens, which actually means that everything happens. And this is the kind of book that often gets me the most excited, because that's real life. That's how it really happens. Aysegul Savas joined me from our studio in Paris. Aysegul, welcome to Bookends. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I want to talk first a bit about your experience and background, because I know this isn't an autobiographical novel, but it certainly draws a lot on things that you've gone through in your life. Your work often explores what it means to be a young person living away from home, living in a foreign country. Can you tell us a little bit about your own nomadic life and your upbringing?
I was born in Istanbul, and then we moved to Adana and to Ankara, and then from there to London and Copenhagen, came back to Istanbul to go to high school, and then I went to college in the US, in Vermont, and then I lived in San Francisco in the Bay Area for close to 10 years. I mean, it's strange. Paris is the city where I lived the longest in my whole life, and I've only lived here for a little over a decade. I guess that sense of not having a home and making a home of a new city, a foreign city, this idea that I have no childhood home to return to, and yet, humans have a desire for home, to feel rooted. And I guess I also started writing the novel at a certain threshold in my life when I realized that I was perhaps not young anymore, or that I was about to become not young. And it was this a painful discovery that, one feels young and yet also has to make decisions and take on big responsibilities. And I wanted to somehow, before I officially was no longer young, I wanted to encapsulate that time of being irresponsible, but being irresponsible grown-ups.
As you've mentioned, you've lived in so many different places, and it's interesting to hear you speak about Paris being the place you've lived the longest, but it's only been a decade out of your life. How did you end up in Paris specifically?
My husband and I ended up here a little bit randomly. As I said, we lived in the Bay Area before this, and my husband is from Latvia. And quite frankly, it was just a really, really long flight to go back to Latvia or to go back to Istanbul to see our parents. So we had this vague idea that at some point we'd move closer to home, and we both happened to speak French, and we thought, well, Paris might be a good city to do that. But, we thought about this as this very abstract future when we would make real life decisions. And then at some point, we were quite happy in California. And at some point, there was a job opening in my husband's field. He's an applied mathematician. And I remember us still thinking, oh, this will be an adventure. We'll just go for a few years. And we weren't thinking this also happens to correspond with our future plan, because we were thinking we're still so young. Obviously, we're not committing to anything. And it's surprising to me to realize that was a choice we made that sort of I don't decided what our futures might look like. We still live in Paris and we intend to do so.
There's that phrase that's like, life is what happens while you're sort of making other plans. And I feel like that's, we make these certain choices and you can't always see into the future what the sort of long tail of that choice is going to be and how it's going to really shape perhaps decades of your life. You think it's something you're doing for a little bit. I think about that a little bit too much in my own life. It sometimes scares me off from making certain choices because I'm like, I don't know what these consequences are going to be.
And other choices you make are totally random and short-lived. I'm just thinking about all of the jobs that I worked before I committed to writing. And again, with all of those, I would think, oh my God, like maybe this is what I'm going to end up doing for the rest of my life. And, I'd work that job for like 3 months. Mm-hmm. So there's, one also doesn't know what choices will stick and what will change.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a bit more about the setting of your novel because it takes place in this unnamed and ambiguous city. And the story centers on this young couple, Asya and Manu, who are both foreigners from different countries, but we also don't know exactly where they're from. What appeals to you about writing this kind of ambiguous story that could take place anywhere, where you're not getting into the specific identities of the characters and you're letting their relationship sort of play out in this almost liminal space?
I've done this in one other novel, and I it's something that I notice I do in many stories where the characters are in unnamed cities, but you can tell often that it's a European city or, vaguely North American city or whatever. And I did consider naming the city, calling it Paris or, setting it in some other city that would be fun to write about, someplace in Italy or Germany. And finally, I thought that's going to be a little bit distracting because I do want to explore the more universal aspects or shared aspects of being foreign and, young people who are trying to settle down where, in a metropolitan city. And that's why I decided that I would blur the edges of the city that does resemble Paris because it's a city I know, so that it could be in many different cities around the world and could convey a sense of both, this beautiful, joyful place, but also a place that's difficult to integrate into.
The novel is really told through the lens of this main character, Asya, who's a documentary filmmaker, but she's in this long-term relationship with Manu, who works for a nonprofit organization, and they're very, very tight-knit. Like, they sort of are each other's whole world in this city where they're both foreigners, both expatriates. Can you tell me a little bit more about them and their connection to each other? Because I thought that this relationship where they're both kind of unmoored and they don't actually come from a shared community, they're not from the same country, that's not the country that they're living in. I thought that was so interesting.
The whole book is about making a home out of new experiences or elements of foreignness. So it made sense to me that Asya and Manu wouldn't share a culture or a native tongue. And I guess one of the leading questions for the novel was if anthropology is the study of humans and, their habits of belonging and making meaning, what would an anthropologist study if, Asya and Manu were a tribe of their own? What's the unique culture that they managed to create through their own little rituals and what they consider sacred and profane, which I guess, again, that's much more different than if you were in a relationship with someone of the same cultural background, because then you have holidays to celebrate, religious occasions, many, many things that are common. But if you're from two very different backgrounds, then you have to create that. You have to create your own small culture and then add the complexity of being in yet a third, another foreign place. Then that little culture you create does become something very, very important, even though it's small and it's only shared by two people. And I guess, I suppose one of the challenges of writing this book for me was that there isn't like a big conflict between Asya and Manu, even though they're the central characters. And I thought, well, how is that possible that, you have a novel where the characters just like love one another? and and so I had to think about the book in different terms, in terms that weren't just like this plot arc of, conflict and they must separate or there must be a challenge. But, how do you write about two people that love one another without problem and that are trying to make a life for themselves?
Yeah, they're confronting many challenges, I would say, together in terms of how do they build community in this place? How do they both grapple with maintaining relationships with their respective families back home? They're at an interesting point in their life as well, where they're definitely adults. I loved the detail about they've replaced the posters in their home with real paintings. Like, I've just gone through a process of getting rid of a lot of furniture that I found on the street when I was 21 and replacing it with furniture that I actually purchased. I really enjoyed that. But they're also still very much figuring things out, like whether or not they want to have children, like where do they want to purchase an apartment? Do they even want to take out a loan to purchase their own place, or are they okay to continue renting? And I mean, for me, I'm 25. This is the phase of life that most of the people that I spend most of my time around are kind of in. Why did you want to focus on a couple in this phase of life in particular?
It's such a fleeting period, and it's so unique because you are both an adult and you're young. You're an adult and you're autonomous, but you don't have these big responsibilities. And because I had come to the end of that phase and I had had such a great time and I was so nostalgic about it already, even though I hadn't quite fully left it, I thought I want to write a book that honors this period. And I just, I guess I thought that just would be so fun to write. But also, what we were talking about this, about making choices and not knowing whether that will sort of affect your life forever. It struck me how the practicality of an apartment search and how the metaphor of the future you're choosing really go hand in hand. That, these are people who are about to commit to their future selves. And Asya and Manu are a little frightened of this idea because they don't know what they should commit to, because they don't know what, they don't know what the right answer is. They don't know what their own little culture really looks like.
Aysegul, we've talked a lot so far about Asya and Manu, the main two characters of this book, but they live in this social world that they're sort of creating for themselves in this unnamed city. And one of the focal points of that world is this upstairs neighbor character, an elderly woman named Teresa. And so Teresa's own daughter lives outside the city and doesn't visit very often. And Asya and Manu almost feel a little bit like surrogate family. They're very devoted to her. They spend a lot of time with her. She's part of their weekly routine. What does she represent for them?
I suppose she and their closest friend Ravi are their family. So Ravi, almost like a brother figure, their closest friend, or Teresa, who is a little bit like a grandparent to them. And I guess these characters, Teresa especially, she herself is a foreigner but has lived in the city for a very long time. She represents sort of a model of life that they can look up to and can say, well, this is one way in which we can live. And that it's not a very practical way. She reads a lot of poetry and then she's quite forgetful. But it's quite inspiring to them, I think, that they can live with certain abstract, hopeful ideas, such as, reading poetry into your old age.
I think the intergenerational aspect of this relationship was really interesting as well. And I know that in 2018, you wrote an essay for the Paris Review about your own upstairs neighbor who was a poet named Anne. It sounds like, from what I read in this essay, like a really interesting woman. Can you tell me a little bit more about Anne? Was she something of an inspiration for Teresa? What sort of a woman was she?
She was, I can't find the right words. She was amazing. She was a poet. She was a very, very good friend of ours, and we did, have weekly dinners with her, reading poetry. And she really is one of the people that probably most inspired me as a writer, as a woman, as a young person. And it's actually quite funny because Anne passed away in 2020. And until she passed away, we were very hesitant to move out of our building and our neighborhood just because we thought, well, we're not going to have Anne. And when we made the decision to move, Anne passed away, I think, the week that we were moving out. And now she's buried in the neighborhood that we moved to, so we visit her very, very frequently. And we do remember, I think, her spirit and her very unpractical and very joyful way of being in the world.
It's so lovely as well that her spirit, it seems, really still animates a lot of your life in this new neighborhood. And it's an interesting coincidence that you're still close to her, even after having both moved in different ways.
Yes. And, there's, I guess, the book is very much based on our experience, even though it's abstracted and it's fictionalized. But when I was writing it, I was filled with this, yearning to honor that a period of time in our lives populated with these people who gave it so much meaning.
Mm-hmm. There's this sort of sense of guilt that Asya feels being so far away from her own grandmother, and particularly when her grandmother needs an operation. There's this conversation of like, do I go home? Asya has this fear that she articulates of becoming a stranger to her own family and being removed during these times of perhaps great trial or stress for her family. And like, I certainly, living far from family within the same country, could relate to that. And my grandmother passed away at the beginning of this year, and I did have the experience of not being able to be around for it. I was like, oof, this is a very real thing.
Yeah.
How do you feel like Asya as a character copes with that? And is that something that was also inspired by perhaps experiences that you had? Like, is this feeling of remove and guilt something that you are familiar with as well?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've spent my entire adult life away from my parents and my family, my siblings, and it feels like it's inevitable that, this is our lives and we live in different countries. But at some point you realize when it happens again and again and again, when you're not really around for really big changes or moments when your family might need you or you might need them, that it is, in fact, a choice that you're making. And Asya and Manu, I guess, also have this attitude of like, well, we're just sort of, living and hanging out and trying not to make too many choices. They're relieved every time an apartment doesn't work out and they don't have to commit to a mortgage. But I think underlying all of that is this fact that you have made a choice, and that choice is to live away from your parents and from your family. And that is going to have dramatic daily consequences in life, such as, seeing your grandmother sick on a screen and not in real life, not being able to hold her hand or whatever it is. It really is a book about daily life. So I wanted to explore that in very small ways. Again, the grandmother's sickness isn't a dramatic point, or like it's not the main plot of this novel, but it's one of the things, one of the sadnesses that you would feel daily, in the same way that, you would feel the joy of breakfast every morning, and you would also feel the sadness of seeing a parent age on a video screen. And I guess also Asya's guilt has a little bit to do with the fact that she's so close to her upstairs neighbor, Teresa, and she's able to be there for dinners. And she can't have this sort of companionship with her grandmother. But at the same time, she has no responsibility for Teresa. If Teresa gets sick, it's her daughter who will have to tend to her. Those intermediary relationships of friendship and companionship, how much responsibility you have, how much you need to care for another person. All of these I wanted to explore in the book.
There was something you said that was so interesting to me in your answer just now, where you mentioned like the grandmother's illness isn't the major plot point of the book. It's just sort of daily life that's taking place. And you're depicting that in this novel, but then throughout the novel, Asya is actually also depicting that in a way. She's working on this documentary project where she's interviewing regular people in a local park. And she says that she wants to film daily life and to praise its unremarkable grace, which I thought was such a beautiful sentiment. That's something that some people don't always think is worthwhile in art. Like, I find myself sometimes having to defend my preference for books and films where nothing really happens, and it's just sort of depicting a day in the life. Why do you feel as an artist that this depiction of daily life is such a worthwhile project?
I mean, I have nothing against books with, big dramatic plots. And obviously daily life isn't, or, sort of small daily life, quiet daily life, routine daily life isn't all there is to life. There are also big dramatic things happening. But I think one, first of all, has to listen to the type of writer that they are. And many of the themes and objects and ideas that compel me in writing have to do with the routine and how we sort of establish our identities in our daily lives. And I also think that part of the beauty of art that reflects daily life, it's a little bit like a still life painting. It makes you see it in a way that you might not have been able to see when you're living daily life. And you think, well, it's just breakfast, or it's just a walk in the park. And when you see it filtered through art, it forces you to, obviously, to slow down, but to see it distorted a little bit and therefore gain some of its beauty. And I think, from that perspective, the types of books that focus on daily life, I think, can teach us something about living in ways that are respectful to one another, or to our communities, or to just, the routine and care of living.
We've started our conversation talking about the idea of home a little bit, and your novel, I think, really demonstrates that home can be found in a lot of places. It can be found in lovers. It can be found in found family. But you've also said in some of your other press that you've done that reading and writing are ways of having home as well, and can be a way that we create meaning and create a sense of place. What do you mean by that?
I have a hard time sort of saying this place, this particular place or country is my home. And there is, there's a sense of freedom to that, but there's also a sense of great sadness and not knowing exactly where you belong, or not having one place to belong. But at the same time, it's difficult to say this one book defines everything I hope to achieve artistically, or, everything that satisfies me in art. And, obviously that is spread out across many, many, many books. And there's something so joyful about the fact that so many books, tens of hundreds of books, make up who you are and make up your imagination. And so I think we're housed in different rooms of different books. But also at the same time, in the period that I am writing a novel, it feels like I always have some place to shelter, just because in the, let's say, 2 or 3 years it takes me to write a novel, I enter that landscape every single day. I engage with those characters. I have, rooms in that house that I can go to. And then once I'm done with that house, I pack it up and then I move on to the next one. And it feels a lot like how I've lived my life so far. But it also feels like in each of those houses, for those several years of inhabiting them, you get a sense of, deep community and connection. And then you feel that, it's over and it's time to move on.
I want to ask a bit about your relationship with some of the places that you've perhaps called home, or not called home, but have inhabited over the course of your life, starting with Istanbul. So you were saying earlier in our conversation you were born in Istanbul, but you didn't spend much time there as a young child. Your family had moved around a lot in Turkey and then in Europe, and you eventually returned to Istanbul as a teenager. But the city often still features in your writing. You had this short story in The New Yorker recently called Freedom to Move, which is set in Istanbul. And so I'm just kind of curious, can you talk a bit about your relationship with Istanbul and how you experience that city today?
I came to Istanbul as a foreigner, and when we moved to Istanbul from Copenhagen, I felt very, very awkward just because I didn't really know, in the new school that I'd started, I didn't know what was cool. My Turkish was very proper compared to the Turkish of my friends. And, I didn't know where kids my age were hanging out. So I guess I had this unease with Istanbul growing up. And I think to make up for that, I studied Istanbul really, really well. And I went all around the city, especially my last 2 years in high school, just to sort of claim it and to make it my own. And every year I went back during college and the years that followed, I would have this sort of both intensity, intense love for the city, but also, again, a certain self-consciousness that it wasn't exactly my city because it kept on changing.
Mm-hmm.
Istanbul has gone through dramatic changes in the past 15 years. And sometimes, certain neighborhoods, I don't recognize them. I can't really find my way around them. So I suppose every time I come back to Istanbul, I have this sense of great yearning for the city where I was a student, but also it's self-consciousness. My husband says he's never seen me more self-conscious than when I'm talking to an Istanbul cab driver, just because, the cab driver will say, oh, should I take this highway or that highway? And it's very difficult for me to admit that I actually don't know because I don't know what he's talking about. I don't know the new roads. Mm-hmm. And almost this embarrassment, that I don't know the city as well as I should. And I think that has to do with not really having a home and thinking that Istanbul is one of my homes. And yet, if it were my home, then why don't I know it intimately?
The not knowing where the good places are to hang out, I think really resonated with me. I often am asked by people for recommendations of what to do in Halifax, and I've never lived there as an adult. So I'm always like, I don't know. You have to ask someone else. Yeah. And I feel a sense of shame sometimes, like I should know better. But of course I know the place that I've lived as an adult much better as an adult. Like it's only natural. I want to ask then about where you are now. You mentioned earlier in our conversation that you've been in Paris for longer than any other place in your life. And I know also that you recently became a mother. You kind of alluded to, you feel like you're exiting this period of your young adulthood. So first of all, congratulations on making, that's a major life change and very exciting. But I'm wondering, has that experience changed your relationship to Paris at all? Because I know you mentioned you're expecting to be in Paris for a long time. I guess that means you're going to be raising a child who does know one home.
Yeah. My relationship to the city changed dramatically because, I would be all around the city, going to readings, meeting my friends, being up all night on the canal, on the Seine, out for picnics, whatever. And now for the past year and a half, it's very, very rare that I leave my neighborhood where our baby goes to daycare and where we take her to the park. And, more than our international friends, I see the mothers, the other parents at daycare, and those are my community now. It's a radically different way of experiencing the city. And it's very surprising to me that she will be a Parisian child. She will learn to bike or swim in our neighborhood, and we'll have such a different experience growing up if there are no major changes in our lives.
Aysegul, I've so enjoyed having this conversation with you. I'm excited to, now that I'm finished reading The Anthropologists, lend it around to all my other wayward 25 to 30-year-old friends.
Thank you so much for your amazing questions. And I'm just so somehow surprised and glad that you can connect to the novel and that, it resonates with you and where you are in life. So thank you for this. This was a great conversation.
Oh, thank you. What you just heard was my conversation with Aysegul Savas. She's the author of The Anthropologists. She joined me from our studio in Paris. This week's show was produced by Katie Swales. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. I also want to thank our techs, Juliana Romanek and Shirley Gao. Thanks also to the entire CBC Books team for making this show happen every week. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.